Good morning and welcome to your favorite television program, Media Monitor. I'm Sakina Kamwendo and I'll be with you for the better part of the next hour. And here's a sneak peek of what we're featuring on today's show. We'll explore the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica data scandal and its role in the Kenyan 2017 elections. We'll also take a look at Human Rights Day commemorations and we ask, has the media been complicit in revising history? We'll also feature a veteran photojournalist on his coverage of the Sharpeville massacre. And of course, great to have you with us. All of that still to come. But before we delve into all of those discussions, let's take a look at what's making headlines in the Sunday newspapers. Starting with the Sunday Times, they're leading with the story about 29-year-old serial rapist Lonwabo Solonsi, and he was sentenced to a jail term that may prevent him from ever seeing the outside of prison again. Now, Solonsi is charged with raping 39 victims in the Eastern Cape, including several teenagers and an 11-year-old, and was, until his arrest, among hundreds of serial rapists stalking women around South Africa. City Press is running with the story about former President Jacob Zuma, and he's being investigated by the Hawks for allegedly accepting a 1 million rand cash bribe from a Western Cape abalone dealer in exchange for keeping Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries Minister Senzenzi Zokwana in his cabinet. The Sunday Independent, they're leading with a story about tender fraud at Telkom. Now, the parastatal is accused of irregularly awarding a multi-million rand security tender to two untransformed companies who did not meet the prescribed market requirements. KZN Sunday Tribune leading with a story about the DA MPs who have condemned calls in the party for its public representatives to better reflect the country's demographics just 2 weeks before its federal Congress. And lastly, we take a look at the Weekend Argus, and they're running with the story about how police divers are searching a crocodile-infested river for the bodies of the British couple Rod and Rachel Saunders, who went missing last month. And that's, of course, what you can look forward to in the papers this morning. But first, we shift gears now to focus on the digital segment, where we look at the hashtags that were some of the conversation starters this week. And to help us do that, we have Babalo. Please talk us through it.
Thank you, Sakina. So I firstly want to focus on what is actually trending on Twitter right now. And the biggest trend at the moment is SAFTA's 12. Those are the South African Film and Television Awards. And one of the notable awards is the film Ingleba, The Wound, winning the Best Feature Film. So we'll see how that hashtag unfolds during the course of the day. And
there was quite a bit of controversy around Ingleba.
Yes,
so I can imagine that some people will have quite a bit to say about it now being, actually acclaimed for that.
And it's back on the big screens now, so people can go watch it.
Indeed.
And then we also have another hashtag, which is hashtag SA versus Australia, with the Australian cricket team basically admitting to ball tampering. Now, the captain says that he has no interest in resigning. So like I said, obviously we'll see also how that develops during the course of the day.
Absolute madness here. Yeah. Because a lot of the action has been happening off the field, as it were. But of course, the ball tampering incident on the field. But what he did there was absolutely fascinating. And I can't understand why he will not resign over this.
And I mean, in terms of, you can imagine the condemnation by people on social media. So they're basically saying that he needs to go. We cannot have a person who is leading a team who's doing things like that, you know?
I mean, it's on the screen at the moment, and you can actually see the lengths to which he went, because he actually had that backup, a cloth that he then alleged he used to actually shine the ball. But we know there was tape involved that's miraculously disappeared.
So this was obviously met with a lot of disappointment, but like I said, we'll see how the hashtag basically unfolds itself as the day progresses. And then in another hashtag that's trending this morning, it is the CTIJF 2018, which is the Cape Town International Jazz Festival. And this year's installment has the likes of international artists like Corinne Bailey-Ray, Robert Glasper, and Jordan Rakei. And then we also had artists such as Amanda Black, Mikasa, and Black Motion, like our local artists who are also rocking the crowds. So that will also unfold as the day progresses. And then in another hashtag, we have hashtag Earth Hour, which is basically like a global call for international unity in addressing the devastating effects of climate change. But Sakina, in terms of all the other stories that were trending this week on social media, we had the floods, right? And we basically saw an image on Twitter where there was a car that drove into a sinkhole. And this was the pictures that was retweeted like over 1,500 times. And basically people on Twitter are saying that, but if a person's car can literally drive into a sinkhole like that, then they're questioning the authenticity of engineers who are on the roads. You know?
Scary, scary stuff. And, you know, I would have thought that at this point, someone would have at least gone and investigated why it is that whenever we have heavy rains, the roads seem to wash away. So, yeah, let's take a look at some of those pictures. And then we
also had a tweet coming through from Traffic SA. This was in Centurion. Centurion was a Mesaste in Centurion, and it was basically just trying to get anywhere was really difficult. And we have Arrive Alive basically using their social media page to tell people that avoidance is better than trying to get through flooded areas. Stay indoors if you have to, but just avoid being in flooded areas. And then we also have the South African government heeding the same call to say that parents just must make sure that their kids are indoors while this is happening.
And there's many more of those.
There's many of those that are coming through, obviously, yes. And then in our other hashtag, Sakina, is the EFF Deputy President Floyd Shivambu. He was involved in what he refers to as a scuffle between himself and a journalist this week in Parliament. He has since apologized for the incident. However, I think the sentiment on social media is that, look, just because you're a big shot in Parliament, it doesn't mean that you have the right to do whatever you think you want to do. Like we have a comment coming through from Wesley saying that hashtag Floyd Shivambu wasn't a race issue. It's an issue of violence and contravention of the freedom of the press, nothing else. Floyd Shivambu acted like a thug. He apologized unreservedly. There's your proof. And then we also have other comments coming through from people saying, basically sharing the same sentiment as the previous tweet that we had, saying that you don't behave like that. No matter what happens, you don't put yourself in a situation where you behave like that. And then we have other people who are actually defending him and saying, we really are a sissy nation. We call that smaller than a handling of hashtag Floyd Shivambu an assault. I'd condemn it if it was on a woman or a child. So those are it's just interesting to see how different opinions are playing out on social media.
Absolutely. But if you want to safeguard yourself, it's simple. Just make sure that you don't put your hands on anyone for any reason.
Indeed. And then obviously South Africa celebrated Human Rights Day on Wednesday. And basically this is a campaign where we have the Bill of Rights, which basically states how many people suffered so that we can enjoy the freedoms that we have today. This was a picture that was shared across Twitter, across Facebook, across even people on their WhatsApp statuses, they shared this. So I thought this was very interesting. And it basically just gives you a breakdown of what people had to go through, the suffering that they had to go through so that we can be free. And then I also liked how a lot of influential people on social media, like Karabo Mokhoko and Mams Bapoyane, were saying that Human Rights Day is a reminder of our rights and the cost paid for them on 21 March 1960 in Sharpeville, 69 dead, 180 wounded for better lives. So they're basically just using their pages to raise awareness and to say that even though we are celebrating this day, let us not forget what this day actually represents.
Well, thank you so much, Pabalo, and those were the major hashtags this week. And after the break, a veteran photojournalist, Peter Makubane, he will recall the events of Sharpeville massacre, so don't go away.
Nations, 44 matches live on SABC 1 and 19 SABC radio stations. SABC is the official broadcaster of the 2018 FIFA World Cup Russia.
When life takes a different turn.
If I didn't eat the speak, he was going to evict me.
Your will to persevere is ignited.
I'm not a professional speaker, but I'll try my best to give you a word of inspiration.
He was just trying to provide for his family.
If you can't accept it, change it. If you cannot change it, accept it.
And a new story begins.
Made a resolve to myself. I'm learning something new.
Upilong, every Friday at 5:30. Be part of the life-changing journey.
32 nations, 44 matches live on SABC 1 and 19 SABC radio stations. SABC is the official broadcaster of the 2018 FIFA World Cup Russia.
Welcome back. Now, this week, South Africa commemorated Human Rights Day, and Media Monitor also spoke to a veteran photojournalist, Peter Makubane, who is one of South Africa's most distinguished and award-winning photojournalists, about the events that happened on the 21st of March 1960. And here's what he remembers about that fateful day.
Sharpeville, you cannot forget. This was my editor. He told me straight that I have pictures, but these are not the pictures that will shock the world. So when I left his offices, I knew what is it that I have to do now. I have to change my style of shooting. I have to change my style of approach, which I did. When the shooting started, I was there, but it was heavy. You had the police watching what you're doing. Fortunately, I was able to record what was there. No one could say, this is a lie. No. I took pictures of people lying on the ground, shot, you know, and people crying for their relatives who were shot. You see, it was very sad. There has never been a sad moment like that for me in my entire life. Even with June 16, it was a heavy day. But I told myself that police or no police, I'm going to do the best I can to record what is going on, so that we're able to tell history the way we saw history. I congratulate myself today for having seen history. I've seen Sharpeville, I've seen Soweto, I've seen many other interesting stories. All tragic days should be commemorated, but unfortunately, politics rule the game.
Well, that was veteran photojournalist Peter Makubane with his thoughts on that eventful day 58 years ago now. And joining us this morning to help us unpack many of these stories that we have this morning, we have, of course, Professor Ilva Rodney-Gumede from the University of Johannesburg. And we are also joined by Professor Simphiwe Sesanti from the University of South Africa. Thank you both so much for coming through this morning.
Thank you very much for having us as well.
Professor Sesanti, let me start with you. Just watching that insert there by Peter Makubane, what are your thoughts? What do you make of, his recollection of that day?
The immediate thing that comes to my mind, as I'm looking at the inhumanity of the people that, stood there and destroyed the lives of others when they were seeking to reclaim their own humanity. The second thing, though, in the context of what we are talking about today, is the courage that was exercised by journalists at the time, knowing that, there was a chance that you could be caught in the crossfire. But here you have this man watching all this, but being determined to set aside his own feelings and insecurities and fears and record this for prosperity.
And he did his part, brave as he was on that day. But subsequently, the media in particular has been accused of being complicit in revising history. So it, of course, is a very sticky question, but let's get into it. The day is called Human Rights Day, and many are asking, why is it not Sharpeville Day?
Well, we've got to recall that, the decision was taken by the South African government, the new, after the post-apartheid government, that decided, like any other days as well, such as Youth Day being June 16. And you could see that, there were organizations that were directly involved, for instance, in Sharpeville. in 1960, that is the Pan-Africanist Congress of Tanzania. But a government that is being led by the ANC of South Africa showed insensitivity to this, by arrogating itself the right to rename this. And so you have resentment, rightly so, from those that belong to the Pan-Africanist Congress of Tanzania about this. But then the question that you are raising, has the media, been complicit in this? The media, have got two roles amongst many. The first one is that our responsibility is to report. And I think that in this case they have reported, but also the responsibility of the media is to give a platform to dissenting voices. So the mere fact that here we're having this conversation, and throughout the week and before then, the media have given platforms to those that feel differently and those that are opposed to. So I think that therefore, in that sense, the media have played, their role in giving a platform to critical voices.
Professor Rodney Gumede, yes, Sharpeville was the epicenter of that fateful day, but the tremors, were felt across this country, Langa and everywhere else where people had the courage to come out. That hasn't been sufficiently been reflected either.
No, I do think that Simpiwe is absolutely right in what he says, that of course there's a sort of a revisionist history in the sense of then taking it out of the direct political party realm, and to somehow remove an ownership. I don't think that we should point fingers and say that this is, necessarily an ANC hijacking in that sense. We can, of course, discuss that. But I think what's important to remember is what you said, that actually Sharpeville Day had, absolutely Sharpeville massacre had ripple effects across the country and was a turning point in the history and in the fight against apartheid. Then we know that things, apartheid didn't stand and fall in the 1960s, came much later. But I think it's important that we also then recognize that this was a fight for dignity, for human rights. So, and that's what we're trying to commemorate. And maybe we can do then, what we can do as a media is to try to actually reinforce that and explain what Sharpeville was all about, and explain our history to our readers, and particularly to younger readers, with 58 years ago, as you rightly pointed out. So it's recent history, but still history that we need to remember and reinforce in the minds of particularly then younger generations maybe.
Should the PAC receive more prominence around this time of year, especially when it comes to Human Rights Day, Sharpeville Day, because they complained this very week that the media was out to portray the fissures, and the fault lines in the PAC, as opposed to focusing on the fact that they had actually come together to commemorate this day?
Comparatively speaking, I'm not quite sure what kind of an assertion is that, because, as it were, the Pan-Africanist Congress of Tanzania, when it led the march, it was leading the march of the African people. And so the story is more about the tragedy than it is about the Pan-Africanist Congress. But it is equally true that it is completely wrong to marginalize an organization that was central in that role. Anyone and everyone who plays a particular historical role needs to be acknowledged and be given that space to tell, the history as it is, and not seek then to give prominence to a particular party, because of the power that it holds, and then, marginalize the other. So in that sense, therefore, that it is incorrect. But at the same time, secondly, quickly, the Pan-Africanist Congress of Tanzania itself needs to take a critical look at its own self as an organization, because in the past, the PAC has given prominence to itself, whenever there are squabbles and all that. On those particular days when the PAC, whatever factions are there, at one stage we saw them fighting, be it one faction that was belonging to Letlapa Mpahlele and other to Lutando Mbinda, being in collision. So what kind of image and projection are you doing? So that issue then needs to be looked at in that sense, because at that stage, the journalists at the SABC, I remember, found themselves caught in a trap when one faction was claiming legitimacy against the other.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll discuss some of the other burning issues here on Media Monitor.
nations. 44 matches live on SABC 1 and 19 SABC radio stations. SABC is the official broadcaster of the 2018 FIFA World Cup Russia.
SABCnews.com is your one-stop digital portal to all the news you need. With a website that is easy to use on mobile, SABC News prides itself in being the primary source of public service content across multiple platforms. Watch live streams of all the big news events on the SABC News YouTube channel, which is one of the most viewed South African YouTube channels globally. And catch up on the best of SABC television and radio news. Follow breaking news on all of the SABC News social media platforms, interact with SABC News on Facebook, and stay connected on Twitter for the latest headlines and real-time updates by our reporters. SABC News, everywhere.
Well, thanks for tuning in to Media Monitor. And we're going to take a quick look now at the stories in the Sunday newspapers. And just asking our guests, Professor Ilva and Professor Simpiwe, to tell us which stories actually caught your attention before I tell you about mine. Professor Ilva, which story there stood out for you today?
Well, I think that it's very interesting what's happening in the Zuma case and prosecutions moving on. And I think that this is going to be, a big story to come for the following week as well. So that definitely is a story that stood out for me. However, I must say that the leading story in the Sunday Times, for example, this morning is about rape. And this man accused of raping 39 women in the Eastern Cape. That's a staggering number of rapes, and we also know that this is a scourge that we can't put,
And as the Sunday Times rightly points out there, it is an absolute nightmare to think that we have all these serial rapists, roaming our streets. And I remember about a year or two ago, there was a case in Middelburg, in Mpumalanga, again, and maybe we don't pay attention to these serial rapists when they actually do their deeds outside of the main areas, the main centers in the country. But it's not just what's happening in the big urban centers. There's lots of this going on in the outlying areas as well. Prof. Simpiwe, which one stood out for you this morning in the stories that have been covered?
Two stories stood out for me. The forthcoming DA, meeting and the contestations that are taking place within the organization. It's going to be very revealing. And the other one is the attempts to postpone, the provincial congresses that are associated with the African National Congress.
Yeah, and interesting that, again, it's the race issue. It's the diversity debate that is hitting the Democratic Alliance. When you talk about a black caucus within the DA, it is something that really gets the DAs back up. But evidently, there's something to it.
It would seem like it, yes. And I mean, this is something that's not new to the DA. And of course, they've been a party that's been under pressure to transform, and we've seen that in the leadership battle as well. Or so yeah, no, this is something that's they're going to have to stay with them for a long time.
Absolutely, and all the papers seem to touch on that. And there's, of course, also a story that I thought was very interesting and the inside of the Sunday Times this morning about Steinhoff, and the fact that the Steinhoff execs, the bosses, will be receiving bonuses in spite of everything that we've been talking about, that we've been hearing, that we're still trying to get to the bottom of regarding Steinhoff. What's your take on that, Prof. Simpiwe?
That's a very interesting one. It perhaps reveals to us how those that are in powerful positions at all times look out for one another. In spite and despite of everything, because when we look at the story, it says much about trying to retain and to keep those that are regarded as being key in the company. And Sakina, I was reading, when I read through the story, I noticed that there was a story about those, but nothing said about the others. Just not Not even a mention.
Absolutely fascinating, Professor Ilva.
No, I think it's what's important with the Steinhoff story as well, and I think this is a sort of a call out to journalists as well, is that we actually need to dig a little bit deeper, because I think what's worth tracing back here is to all the alarm bells that were raised as well, and I think we haven't gotten to the bottom of that. So I think that will be stories to follow as well.
And just looking at some of the quotes in there, and this one stood out for me. Remuneration is not linked to share price or performance. But this is what we throw at those who are working on the shop floor all the time. So how is that acceptable?
That's precisely the point. You know, that the so-called ordinary person is only important in as far as he or she makes a particular contribution to fatten or to enlarge someone else's purse, but thereafter, you know, the rest matters little.
And then just going back to yesterday, I thought what was interesting also in the Saturday Star yesterday was the story about Facebook, which we will be touching on later on. But of course, Arthur Goldstack, he actually likened what's happening with Facebook to and Analytica to Bell Pottinger. What's your take on that?
No, absolutely. They are linked in the sense that here we have these big, you know, companies who have then been implicated in fake news stories, in tweaking data to suit their own purposes, and or to suit the purposes of a potential, you know, income source. Whether that is then, you know, an electioneering purpose or whatever it might be, but that's the story and that's the link.
Well, so this is what our guests have picked up in the newspapers this morning. Absolutely fascinating. And of course, we will go and, as we promised last week, we'll be looking more broadly at the media, not just here at home, but also abroad. And this week in our weekly media roundup, our U.S. correspondent Sherwin Bryce Pease is taking a look at what is actually making headlines and the stories that people are following in North America.
The narrative here in the United States continues to be dominated by what President Donald Trump says and does. And this past week in March was absolutely no different.
What had everyone talking was the appointment of conservative hawk John Bolton as his new national security advisor. The former U.S. ambassador to the UN and more recently a Fox News contributor is a polarizing figure in political circles in Washington. Times had this headline: "The whole world should be concerned. U.S. allies react to Bolton's appointment," compared to how the right-wing Fox News framed it, pointing to Bolton's hawkish presence combined with his bulldog spirit at the White House. This is a man who wrote an op-ed once titled, "To Stop Iran's Bomb, Bomb Iran." Dan Rather on Twitter said if you think going into Iraq was a good idea, and if you still think it was a resounding success, then John Bolton is your guy as the National Security Advisor. President Barack Obama's National Security Advisor and UN Ambassador Susan Rice was more brief, saying, "God bless America." On the business front, President Trump moved towards imposing tariffs on some $60 billion in Chinese goods, sparking concerns of a major trade war with Beijing. This Washington Post article reflects the tit-for-tat nature of how this new development might play out, causing economic alarm around the world. Miami Herald was reporting about how most African nations signed the largest free trade agreement since the creation of the World Trade Organization. Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg had an unforgettable week after admitting to making mistakes that led to millions of Facebook users having their data exploited by political consultancy Cambridge Analytica.
Thank you.
That at the time was working for the election campaign of then-candidate Donald Trump. It took a sarcastic tone, quote, "Mark Zuckerberg is willing to testify to Congress, isn't sure if the Russians have your data, and he's sorry." Major story was the serial bomber causing panic in Austin, Texas for close to 3 weeks. This headline on NBC News questions and then explains why police are not calling Austin bombing suspect Mark Anthony Condit a terrorist.
A white male, leading to some debate as to why authorities didn't label him a domestic terrorist. He, of course, died at the hands of one of his own explosives when he blew himself up as police were approaching. And that then, a look at some of the big stories from the Big Apple and the wider United States. I'm Sherwin Bryce-Pease in New York.
So those are the stories making headlines in the United States of America. And as promised, every week we'll hone in on a different part of the world to bring you what it is that people are talking about there. And don't forget, later on in the show, we'll also bring you our community feature because we are hoping to boost that segment and our interaction in that regard as well. But right now, a UK political consultancy firm, Cambridge Analytica, which claims to use data to change behavior, including that of voters, they've been accused of interfering in elections on a large scale. Now, the firm is at the center of Facebook's election manipulation scandal and is reported to have ran the campaigns of President Uhuru Kenyatta in the 2013 and 2017 Kenyan elections. And they are also in hot water in the United States of America, as it's been reported to have acquired private data, harvesting the information of more than 50 million Facebook users to support Donald Trump's 2016 presidential election campaign. Meanwhile, Facebook has been sued 4 times in Northern California in the federal courts in that particular state. And this week, it has all been about the response to these scandals. So, Professor Ilva, just looking at what is happening here. Again, maybe we should go back to the beginning. That's a good place to start always. And what exactly do we mean here by the harvesting of the information of Facebook users, and how exactly was it used?
Yeah, so what's happened is that Facebook was actually approached by someone, claiming to be a researcher doing research, and he had developed an app which could actually then be used to harvest data. This app was then, launched onto Facebook. People signed up to the app. And that by virtue of signing up to the app, they didn't only give access to their own data, they also then gave access to data from their friends' sites and associated sites. So that's how this came about, and that's how it spread so quickly, and that's why we're talking now about, the region of 50 million, users that's been affected by this app and the data breach that's happened then. Now, what happens with this data is a completely different case. So now Cambridge Analytica gets hold of this data, and they can use it then to build other apps, to build profiles around our behavior and our interests, and that's how data is used on Facebook anyway. So the way that Facebook actually operates is to have profiles on the users to sell advertising, for example. However, when this data then and this profiling is used for purposes that of trying to gauge voter behavior, for example, then it becomes something else. Because if we can profile, if we have a conversation on Facebook, the 3 of us, about our dislikes and likes, and maybe something affecting our area, for example, service delivery problems, then that data can then be used by a politician, for example, as was the case or the alleged case in the US elections, for example, and also in the Brexit vote in the UK. For purposes of actually, as a politician, I can go out and I can target this area and I can play up my hand here. I will do everything, to deal with your particular problems in this area, for example, and you become very targeted in that sense, which might have very little to do with actually your party agenda and the policies that you really want to enforce. So then it becomes something different. I hope that's...
So essentially using the information that we put out there willingly on these sites, these social media sites, and using that to psychologically manipulate or subtly influence our thinking and our choices around certain matters. But how do they physically go about doing that?
I don't know all the technology, but what's happened here is that there's an app, So we subscribe then as users of Facebook to that app, So the app can then gather that data for us. What happened in the Facebook case, as I understand it, is that now this data is harvested and then transferred back to a server, Cambridge Analytica. And when this was exposed, and actually already in 2015, Facebook was made aware of this and then asked Cambridge Analytica to remove the data, to delete the data of their servers, which apparently didn't happen, and that's also the controversy. So what's happened in between, 2015 when this data was first harvested and 2018, we don't know. So, this data could have been used for a lot of different purposes if it's been there and it's been stored.
But what about issues of privacy, for example? Because you have all these settings where you assume that your data will not be shared without your permission.
Well, in this case, you see, users did give their permission. No, I think unwittingly so. But, the app was constructed in that way that you had to sign up for it and you have to then, actually give permission for the app to work in the way that it was developed to do. So this is something, we need to, and I think this is really, really important, and I've said this many times before. There's a lot of actually education that needs to happen around social media and privacy settings in general. And I think we're really, really bad at it. And I think that we have a huge responsibility here. I mean, Facebook has a huge responsibility, of course, but, it might not be in their interest either that people's security settings are, that's strict if they want to harvest some data for purposes of selling ads, for example, or you say for profiling their users. But I think as, the general public, and when we use social media, we need to be very well aware of how we try to protect ourselves and the security settings that are there that we can use to protect ourselves as well as we can do. But there are certain things that we can't guard ourselves against either, and that's problematic.
It reminded me of some of the messages that suddenly get shared with you out of nowhere. So, for example, in the lead up to the 2016 local government elections, where suddenly you get messages that are from people of the far right purportedly, and all sorts of things that you don't understand. Okay, how did this come to me? Why did this come to me? And then also looking at the ANC's elective conference last year in December, and talks about bots and all sorts of technology being brought in and used and manipulated to actually secure a certain outcome. So what's your take on that, Professor Simpiwe?
No, it reveals very much so that there's a very thin line, as we should always understand, between politics and commerce. So that, what should be observed as ethics at all times is disregarded. So that, the point would be that the end always justifies the means. So those that are caught in the crossfire, there is little concern and there's certain disregard, for people. So that's my sense, and it is always there. We experience this, and I think that this story is a typical case.
Is there any recourse in the final analysis for Facebook users, users of other social media sites, Professor Ilva? Because you listened to Mark Zuckerberg this week, and there was a sense of accountability at first, but, the apology was somewhat reserved, in my view, until much later on, where it then became a lot more forceful. So what sort of recourse do you have in this instance?
It's going to be interesting to see, because now Facebook, of course, is being asked to answer for what's happened here. I don't think that they are, neither are we so clear on where the line goes here. So what the recourse might be, we have to actually fully understand what privacy breaches there have been, and what we've actually subscribed to and what we haven't subscribed to. And I think these are very, very important questions that needs to be answered firstly. And I think it's hugely important that Facebook also steps up, because, of course, they've always said we're an open platform, this is a platform where we are, supposed to share in one big happy community, and it's a bit of a, in line with this idea of an open internet, And this, of course, goes against it then again, when there's these kind of privacy breaches where actually we are not sharing willingly, but information is then extracted from us instead.
And of course, in the global village that we live in, if this is happening elsewhere, you can bet your bottom dollar it is happening here as well. So more Media Monitor when we return.
This is your midday report. Good afternoon.
I will be faithful. I assume as President of the Republic of Kenya.
Let's take a look at how African markets and currencies are performing now.
The central bankers say the success of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies is just a bubble.
Breaking stories, detailed economy and sport. Tune into Midday Report every Monday to Friday from 12 p.m.
32 nations, 44 matches live on SABC 1 and 19 SABC radio stations. SABC is the official broadcaster of the 2018 FIFA World Cup Russia.
Well, thanks for tuning in to Media Monitor. And as introduced last week, we will now every week take a look at community media across the country. And this week, our producer, Sibusisiwe Tongo, went to Alexandra Township, north of Johannesburg, where she spoke to Alex FM's news editor, asking her about what determines their news bulletins.
The biggest story of the day in Alexandra, as we are a community radio, is the SGB elections. They've started in the early this month, but they are being held every weekend. What is going on, why we are saying this is our biggest story, is because of what transpired after each and every SGB elections. It's something that doesn't make parents happy, because some of the parents are not allowed to come and vote. Why? Because there are procedures or requirements that needs to be followed when any parent can come and be part of the SGB to elect the new SGB. So what is happening currently is that from the weekend that we are just coming from, some of the parents were not allowed to enter the school because of they were late, whilst others, they don't have identity documents, whereas others, they've managed to come in time. And then when checking their names in their voters roll, in the school's voters roll, where the list of their kids are being written down, the names of their parents are not there, whereas others, their names are not there, but is the name of other parents. So that's where the confusion came from.
25 minutes before 12 o'clock, Tandiso Mazwai Ari Ndiza Kulibala on Alex FM, and this is the real Dilina Chuchua Hasian. Still not join again and that is Sydney Matibula.
The story that you choose, what are they based on, and how determine a story as the biggest story of the week?
So as media people, we get information from the community or from the people that we serve. So the story that we get from them, we see how big is the story within our community before going out. So that's why I'm saying the biggest story of us now as we speak is the SGB elections. But again, we did have land invasions previously, which were happening around Alexandra. The situation is calm now, but as we speak, we still have another land invasion in Waterfall Estate in Midrand. That's where some of the people from Alexandra are part and parcel of people who invaded that land. So it also boils back to Alexandra. So now we're taking the story as part of our bulletin.
There's a greater disrespect for Batbaruna, you know, that's where it starts.
For us as a radio station, our services is obviously to disseminate information, content distribution, to educate, inform, and also entertain our people. And for us to being a community radio station is a blessing in disguise, because the content that we distribute is a local content. So it's the same content that we are part of as the radio station. I always tell my presenters that they are not the celebrities like those who are in the mainstream. They are community workers. So the content that we forever disseminate into our people is a content that is of local, and people, they receive it because that's their stories. You know, listening to radio in the morning, you want to tune into Alex FM and just check what happened overnight in the same castle that you are staying at. So it's what makes us unique, and I believe that our people, our listeners, they are receiving it very well because we are telling their stories.
Alex FM News.
Must say, I absolutely love this new feature looking at what community newspapers and also radio stations and television stations now in communities are covering. And fascinating to see there the SGB elections, land invasions, because those are very topical issues at the ground level. But we're going to take a look now at what to expect in the week ahead with our guests. Professor Ilva, let's start with you. What do you think will be hogging the news headlines this week?
I think let's maybe start where we started at the beginning. I think that we'll have to watch the weather conditions. You know, there might be so that we have more bad weather coming in, and the big story, of course, are going to be the floodings. And I think that we haven't covered it enough, actually. And it happens every year. And we know that the communities are worst hit are always the poorest of the poor, and I think we need to keep on that story as journalists. Maybe we need to watch the Zuma story as well, and then we'll have to see what happens with Facebook and the responses to the Cambridge Analytica story as well, and how Zuckerberg fears maybe we're looking at.
You know, as you're talking about the weather story, the thing that Pabalo mentioned earlier during the digital segment about road engineers, there must be something there. It cannot be that our roads are so poorly constructed that they just wash away. Something needs to be done there. And I'm hoping someone will actually take the time to do a story about that, because all the tarred roads across Gauteng, if you drive around now, have potholes and in some instances proper ditches. So you need to wonder what is going on there. But Professor Simpiwe?
As Ilva was saying earlier on, that we start from the beginning. I think for me, these stories that I mentioned earlier on, the story of the DA and the diversity within it is going to be a very interesting story to follow. And I hope that much more can be given to us by the media so that we can understand better, the dynamics within the DA. And I think that the story again, of the postponement of the provincial congress within the African National Congress and the implications that those are going to have for the lasting tensions within the African National Congress.
And all of this, of course, in line with what's to happen in 2 weeks' time, the DA's Congress. You've got everything moving towards next year's general elections. And how are the parties shaping up for you as we look at it right now?
As I see things, there is little that is changing. We continue to see, where the so-called main players within the political field, and we're hearing very little about, other small parties and how they are faring. But of course, it tells us a lot about the news values. The point we're making earlier on that, our interest is always prominence, proximity, and negativity.
Very interesting. Professor Ilva?
No, I would agree with that, and I think that it's going to be interesting. And of course, we are coming up for elections, and our political coverage is going to be big and hopefully good.
Well, thank you so much to both of you, Professor Ilva and Professor Simpiwe, for joining us this morning. And thanks to all of you at home for watching our show, Media Monitor, this morning. And we hope that you'll join us again same time next week. And from me and the rest of the team, have a blessed day and enjoy what lies ahead.
32 nations, 44 matches live on SABC 1 and 19 SABC radio stations. SABC is the official broadcaster of the 2018 FIFA World Cup Russia.
Our stories.
How do I begin?
Our lives. When all seems to fail, we will raise our voices a bit louder for our justice.
I went into absolute shock. My whole body was shaky. I couldn't hold a phone, but there he was. I couldn't believe the nonchalant that they were still in the area 2 weeks later.
times when the justice system is not able to help us with our individual battles.
I'm willing to do anything. What are you doing? Nothing. Feeling sorry for yourself? No, it's not an option.
These are stories on Cutting Edge Channel 404.
32 nations, 44 matches live on SABC 1 and 19 SABC radio stations. SABC is the official broadcaster of the 2018 FIFA World Cup Russia.
G'day Trenders, today we are in the sunny Seychelles on the little island of Digue. It is the smallest of the 3 sister islands, and because it's so small we can take a tour right around the island. I have my sunscreen, I have my sunglasses, and I have my tour guide, so let's see what this island has to offer. Because the island is so small, one can literally just hop on a bike that you cannot miss as you leave the ferry and start your own tour. Or you could do the cow-driven tours for small groups. At one time, the main industry on Digue was coconut farming, and it's had quite a booming vanilla plantation centered on La Union Estate. But these days it is run as an informal theme park and gives real insight into Digue's colonial history. There is a wooden ticket office at the park entrance, which doesn't look too official, but since this is a national reserve, the park area is fenced and there is no other way to get in. The guides on the island are pretty hands-on and took us through the process of how it was done in the days of old. One of the highlights is the traditional copra mill with an ox that complements the culture of the island and offers you the chance to see copra being made. The ox, named Victor, is yoked to a large weight, harnessing what can only be likened to a large wooden spoon that essentially mashes the copra, squeezing oil from the coconut kernels.
Okay, every day I put 35 kilos of the dry coconut to get 10 liters of coconut oil. 35 to 10 liters. 35 to 10, did you?
Yes, you heard correctly. 35 kilograms of dried coconut only gives you 10 liters of coconut oil. We spent quite a while milling around the mill, loving on Victor, and just being fascinated with the experience. The plantation house is one of the oldest examples of French colonial architecture on Digue, but under the home is a little curios with swipe facility, and I was going to be able to buy something after all. The curios is filled with all types of Seychelles keepsakes, from artwork to shell and beaded jewelry, soaps to handcrafted tortoises, and the famous coco de mer on keychains and ornaments and handbags. Besides shopping, a short walk takes you to the Aldabra giant tortoise enclosure. They are literally everywhere. They are huge and steady, never in a hurry. Their lifespan is about 150 years and they weigh over 250 kilograms. You can feed and pet them and take pictures. They are not dangerous, unless of course you poke your fingers into their mouths.